Hi, everyone. We're going to give everybody just a few more minutes to log in. I see the attendee number is continuing to go up. So we're going to give everybody just a minute and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so as people continue to log in, how about I start by introducing myself? I'm going to turn my camera off eventually to kind of go through my slides with you. But as means of an introduction, first and foremost, my name is Amanda Dumschlanger, and I am one of the career counselors in the Office of Intramural Training and Education at the National Institutes of Health. Prior to coming and working at the NIH, I was the Director of Career Services at Georgetown University and also at Johns Hopkins University for the School of Advanced International Studies. And so in total, I've worked in career services for about 15 years now. And I've been a career counselor at the NIH for going on 6 years now. So I've worked with thousands of students and trainees at this point in my career on a variety of different career development topics. But really the main one and the most popular reason for trainees and students coming to make appointments with me is really for what we're going to be talking about today. Resumes, CVs, cover letters, how to present yourself and how to kind of market yourself effectively, whether you're applying for jobs or applying to college. So there's a few kind of housekeeping items, and then we're going to go ahead and start the presentation. Everybody is muted right now, but if you have a question, feel free to send that throughout the presentation. My wonderful colleague, Dr. Z, is on the back end, and she's going to be answering some of the questions, but I'm definitely going to allow for time at the very end of our presentation to kind of touch base and see which questions are coming up for you as you hear some of the information that I'm presenting today. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that I'm getting to as many questions as possible. Hopefully we'll be able to get through nearly all of them. So feel free to definitely send those questions throughout the presentation. Just one other note, the slides are actually are also going to be available to you after the presentation. So, and as a link of this recording will be available online as well. The slides are actually currently listed in one of the handouts, so you should be able to access it there. And so hopefully that will kind of help you as you're referencing some of the links, some of the resources that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I think those are all of the housekeeping items, so let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to hide my camera for now, so bye for now. Okay, so presenting yourself, resumes, and social media. One sort of disclaimer about resumes is that there are very few rules about these documents in general. There are a lot of different guidelines and sort of best practice recommendations, but there are lots of also different opinions that everybody has sort of about resumes and job search documents. So recognize that what I'm sharing with you today is a mixture of what I see as best practices and also sort of my own opinions on what I think is going to work well for you. So you might hear something different from some of your career mentors or even your guidance counselors. And ultimately, these are your documents. So you can really use them and sort of take the advice that you're hearing and tailor it to see what you think is best for you. Okay. So a lot of times people will come in and ask me really sort of the basics of what is a resume. And a resume is a document that you are going to continue to work on creating and honing really throughout your career. So I like to think of it as a marketing document, and it's just one document within sort of your overall professional portfolio. Your overall professional portfolio often consists of your resume, your cover letter, perhaps letters of recommendation as well. But really your resume is often very short, usually about 1 to 2 pages is my recommendation. I'm going to go into that a little bit more later on. And really presenting what you see as sort of your most relevant experience, accomplishments, and education. Resumes often contain lists of skills and techniques. And if you're doing this well and in the ways that oftentimes career counselors recommend, resumes are often adapted and edited for each specific job application or where you're applying. So I recognize that probably most people signing into today's presentation are just early on in their career, in high school even, and thinking about sort of next steps in terms of college admissions and those applications. And so it is okay for kind of college admissions purposes to have sort of a general resume, but once you actually start going into the employment sector, you're really going to want to make sure that you're adapting that for each position at hand. One of the biggest questions that I get as a career counselor is really what is the difference between a CV and a resume? And so you may have already heard this at some point in your life and your career at this point of, send me your CV or send me your resume. And it can be very confusing to know which document you need to use for which purpose. If you're in high school and if you're just kind of early on in your career, I would always default to using a resume. But I'm going to go over some of these differences just so you're aware of the different words that people are using about these documents, so that further on in your career, you'll have a better idea of which document to use when. So CVs are often used for academic. So if you're applying for an academic position or if you're applying for different fellowships, I often see a lot of CVs, which is short for curriculum vitae. I see a lot of CVs at the National Institutes of Health because in this role I work with scientists who are often applying to academic and faculty positions. And so they need a CV, which is going to be sort of an ongoing academic and work history. And CVs are often very, very long. There's really no length restriction to CVs. A lot of times they're so long because people are putting on every single presentation that they've done, every single publication, conferences that they've attended, mentoring experience, teaching experience, research experience. So there are a lot of different sections and content that you can include on a CV that you wouldn't necessarily see on sort of a more tailored, concise version of a resume. And for your purpose right now, I would really think about keeping your resume short and to the point. I've seen people's CVs who are applying for faculty jobs that were upwards of 20 pages long. And at some point in your career, you might be at that stage. But for now, especially if you are in high school, I would really recommend keeping it short and using a resume. So to kind of hammer that point home, I was reading the US News and World Report blog in preparation for this presentation, and they were giving some of the avoid these big college application mistakes. And so they interviewed different deans of admissions from universities about what they were kind of looking for. And so one of the things that I think is very appropriate for this presentation today is don't turn in a lengthy resume. So here's a quote from the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Bates College in Maine. And she wrote, respectfully, a 17-year-old student should not have or submit a 3-page resume. So really keeping it to a page or two is going to be your best bet. The general rule of thumb, just so you kind of have a sense, is about 7 years of professional experience per page. So there are a lot of times that I'm even working with mid-career professionals, and they have a hard time condensing their resume onto a page or two, but it's really necessary for either the sector that they're applying to. A lot of times private sector jobs like consulting, banking, they really only want to see a 1-page resume. So it's not just you that has to kind of keep it to kind of a short page. Even sometimes big career professionals have to kind of whittle their length down. So maybe you have already been asked for a resume at some point in your life. Um, when were you going to need this document? I think this is a document that you're going to find from here on out keeps coming up, and you're going to need to kind of keep having it on hand and ready to go. So you often use a resume if you're applying for seasonal jobs or work study jobs on campus at a university. Sometimes it is a part of your college application, but there is sort of a big asterisk by this one, that this really does vary by school. So your future university actually may forbid submitting a resume, or they may actually require, encourage, or just only optionally accept resumes. So make sure that you're kind of checking and seeing what that is for you. A lot of times resumes are also used when you're applying for different scholarships or fellowships, sometimes even within the university. And then the last part is, and this kind of feels a little bit more informal, but if you end up doing any sort of networking, informational interviews, and we're going to talk a little bit about networking at the very end of my presentation when I talk about social media and LinkedIn specifically. But if you end up doing any of that, you are going to find that a lot of people will ask for a resume as sort of a general background into you. It's a great way to kind of quickly get a snapshot of your experiences, your skills, and what you've done so far in your high school career and in your life. So maybe you're thinking at this point in the presentation, I don't have a resume yet. Maybe I don't need to worry about it. And I would argue that you should actually start creating one now. Even if you don't feel like you necessarily need it, even if it's not a requirement for your specific college application. And I think it's a really good activity for people to kind of sit down and reflect and think about their experiences and how they're going to be marketing that going forward. It's also a chance for you to kind of check in with yourself and see which of these experiences you've liked, you can kind of gravitate toward. It can actually be sort of a career exploration activity, if you will. And so I would really even start making a master document. And this should really be sort of a running list of things that you've done. And so I think you can look to the College Common Application as a means for some guidance on what you should include in this master document running list. So definitely thinking about sort of your education and diving even deeper into your education. What are some courses that you've taken? That's actually a very common section on resumes is relevant coursework. Academic projects that you've worked on, things that have kind of gone above and beyond sort of what happens in the traditional classroom. Likewise, experience. So if you've already participated in different internships, you have a summer job or you have a part-time job during the academic year, those are all things that you're going to want to kind of think about and kind of have on your running list. And then honors and awards. So honors and awards are really important and it's a really great section to include on your resume, especially when you are applying to colleges and universities. So they're really going to be looking at that as sort of a marker of your potential and your success. So a lot of times when you're thinking about what to include on your resume, a lot of times people are asking for resumes and kind of wanting to see this information because the best predictor of your kind of future behavior and success is your past behavior and success. So, when you're creating this document, please, please, please don't be modest. Like really think about everything that you've done and really going into detail about all of it. Because another thing that I would encourage you to think about is the fact that you're not always going to remember these details as clearly and as accurately as when you're currently doing them. A lot of times when I meet with students or scientific trainees at the NIH who are kind of early on in their career, the resume tends to bring a lot of people into my office as sort of a good opening because a lot of people are really asking for sort of resume critiques. And so sometimes when I see people who have sort of a light resume and they don't have a lot of experience listed, I start asking questions about what they've done, what that experience was like. And I quickly realized that this person just wasn't thinking about kind of speaking in the way that you need to on a resume. So, or they haven't necessarily captured sort of all of their experiences because they didn't keep this running list. So definitely start thinking about kind of adding that in as you're continuing to participate in different experiences. So what can you include on your resume? So this slide is pretty wordy, but it's kind of an overview of different sample resume sections that you can have on your document. And as it says, this is not exhaustive. So there are many more sections that you could probably actually include on your documents. But without fail, sort of there are three main sections that you absolutely need to have. And so I put those in red and bolded them because you're always going to need to include your contact information, your education, and your experience. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about each one of those sections in later slides. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that now, but other sections that you can have on your resume include even sort of delineating different experiences. So community service experience, teaching, mentoring experience, leadership experience. I see a lot of people list certifications and licensures. So for those of you high school students who have done any babysitting and got certified in first aid, or are thinking about med school and went through EMT training, those are all things that you can and should list on your resume. Honors and awards, again, that's another very common section to have on a resume, especially for high school students. So a lot of times that often comes sort of after education, and they can be different awards that you've received through school or even outside of school. Professional development and trainings, if you've taken any courses or classwork outside of school, or if you've even started attending any conferences. Professional service, patents, publications, those are probably going to be sections that you're going to have on your resume later on in your career. But then the other final section that is a really good thing to have on your resume, it's usually the very last section on your resume, is a skills section. And I'm going to show you sort of an example of a resume later on, and I'll show you kind of where that could fit. But skills often, it's helpful if you kind of categorize them. So a lot of times I'll see people list sort of their technical lab skills, maybe computer software. So if you know R, Python, SPSS, those are all really good things to kind of have on your resume. Languages, so maybe your first language isn't English, maybe it was Spanish, and you'll want to kind of list that on your resume, or any other languages that you're proficient in. Those are all really good selling points and are really good ways to kind of market yourself. As you're thinking about sort of skills, when you're applying for different jobs, the skills section is actually a really great section for matching those keywords from the job description. So pay close attention to sort of what you see within a job description, if it is sort of, if you're using your resume for a job application, and making sure that you're sort of kind of mimicking the language, and especially the keywords that you're seeing within there. So as I noted, this is not an exhaustive list. The order and how these appear can vary depending on your own personal resume. It really can and should be personalized for you. One of my biggest resume tips is to kind of lead with what you think are your strongest attributes at the current moment. A lot of times your education, especially if you're just starting out in your career, is going to be one of your strongest attributes. Believe it or not, there might come a time in your career, and I meet with a lot of sort of mid to advanced career professionals who don't feel like their education is their biggest selling point anymore, and so they end up leading with their experience and different roles that they've had there. Okay, so now delving down into the different sections that I just talked about. So you're always going to have to include your contact information. I remember reviewing somebody's resume that ended up going on 2 pages, and their contact information, they had made their margins so small that their name was cut off when you printed the resume. So make sure that when you print it and you turn it into a PDF or whatever you're doing, that your name and your contact information is visible to whoever is reading it. So here's a way to kind of structure this contact information in its most basic form. So obviously your name, your address, your phone number, and your email. And I would really encourage you to, when you're applying anywhere, whether that's for a job or for college, always make sure that you're kind of projecting the most professional and polished version of yourself. So always check your incoming voicemail and make sure that your email is professional. I have been doing this for a very long time, and so I remember back in the day when, and I don't even know if they're still popular, I'm showing how old I am, that ringback tones were really popular. And so we called somebody to interview for a job, and they had like a really profanity lace, like ringback tone. And it definitely made us kind of question their professional judgment. Or I remember looking at a resume, and this woman had put her email as like hotchick@hotmail.com, and things like that. You don't want to make anybody have sort of any like seed of doubt of sort of your overall professionalism. So make sure that everything that you have listed is going to be kind of in the most professional nature. So if you I also do see sometimes people exclude their home address entirely. And there is sort of a trend toward just kind of including your phone number and email. And that's okay if that's what you choose to do. Another way to structure this is if you end up going to college and you have sort of your college current address, but you still want to make sure that you're getting mail and you want to include your permanent address. This is a way to kind of make sure that both of the addresses are also listed and available. Okay, now on to education. So education section is going to probably be, for most of you, the very first section after contact information. So the example that I have here is obviously for somebody who's a little bit further along in their career and their education. But I included this because I want you to kind of have a sense of all of the things that you need to include within this section. So first and foremost, you need to list the school's name. You also need to list the location for each school. So if you're going to high school here around the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland, make sure that's listed. You also need to say sort of what your designation is. So if you're getting a Bachelor of Science or a Doctorate of Medicine or a high school diploma, you need to list sort of what that degree is going to be. And then this is different for education versus experience, but for the dates that you're listing under education, you generally only list the month and year of your graduation date. So if you have not graduated yet, you can put, sort of as this person did, anticipated May 2020 or expected May 2020. That's totally fine to kind of also list there. But generally, you don't put a range unless, of course, the exception is if it was a study abroad experience that you only did for maybe a semester or a year, then you would put sort of January to May 2013 as this person did. One of the main questions that I get about education on a resume is whether or not you should include your GPA. And so you're going to see sometimes for certain job applications, they might ask, they might actually require it. Obviously, if you're applying to college or grad school or whatever it might be, you're going to be submitting an academic transcript. So they're going to see a very, very detailed overview of your grade point average and how well you did in each class. So you can list it on your resume, or you can kind of omit it and just let them look at the transcript. The general recommendation is, excuse me, if you have a 3.0 or higher, to feel free to include it on your resume. And for those of you who are in high school right now, this doesn't apply to you, but at some point during your college and university days, you're going to actually take off your reference to high school. So there is usually no reference to high school after your sophomore year of college. So that's often very eye-opening for university students, and sort of hopefully a motivation to quickly get involved in sort of new activities and organizations when you're in college and at your university. Okay, after your education section, the next section that comes is your experience section. And experience can include a wide variety of different things. It can include paid positions, it can include unpaid positions, volunteer roles, it could have been a part-time position. Most people at high school don't have any full-time positions at that point. But, you know, I think that those are all, you know, sometimes when I am meeting with people who are just early on in their career, they think that experience can only be about paid positions. And that's really, really not true. So experience encompasses all of these different things. You can even include under experience sort of involvement in different student organizations or even community service that you've participated in. So those are all things for you to kind of brainstorm and think about what could actually be included sort of under your experience section. I am a big fan of labeling the experience something. So, oftentimes when I'm going through and doing resume critiques, I will actually encourage people to actually specify the different types of experience. So given the fact that I work at the National Institutes of Health, I work with a lot of people who have to label their experience research experience or public health experience. If you end up applying for a position where you don't feel like there's kind of a common thread that you want to market for that role, or even if you're just looking at your experiences and they seem kind of all over the place and you can't really find that commonality, you can simply label your experience relevant experience, and then everything else that maybe doesn't seem as appropriate for that position, related experience. And that can be a way to make sure that the person reviewing your resume sees sort of that role that you want them to see kind of first and foremost. So think about doing that, especially later on in your career, labeling your experiences as something different. Okay, now I'm going to show you an example of, and the slide is not changing, but I'm going to show you an example of how you can actually structure the experience section on your resume. So in this example, this person has chosen to designate their experience leadership experience. And so they want to talk about the fact that they were the student body president at Walt Whitman High School. So they're doing all of the things correctly so far. You can see that the role of what they were involved in is listed, where they did this is listed, the location, and then also the dates. So those are really the 4 things that you have to have listed for every single experience. Sometimes I see people forgetting to include it all, and it is really important that you make sure that all of that information is available for the resume reviewer. After that's sort of delineated, you're going to want to go into detail about what you did within that experience by creating a few bullet points that you're going to put under this section. So showing you this example, this person wrote, elected by peers to oversee all student-run programming for over 500 students for the class of 2020 academic year. Develop and maintain a working budget of $5,000. Work closely with the treasurer and senior class committee. Created a new diversity programming and campaigns for inclusivity. So this person is doing a good job of kind of talking about what that experience was like and sort of what they did within this role. So I feel that sometimes the hardest part of creating a resume is one, not only kind of remembering all of the experiences that you've done, like I touched on earlier, but it's very difficult to write well-worded bullet points. And if you struggle with this, you're not alone. I think it's something that even mid and advanced career professionals really struggle with. Because it's difficult to convey information in a very professional, concise way where it's also you also feel like you're telling the reader something that's going to kind of be important for them to know about you. So some things to think about as you're writing bullet points, and I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail because I really feel like this is sort of the nitty-gritty of a resume. But make sure that you're starting each bullet point with an action verb. So we really want you to have sort of a strong active voice throughout your document. I don't encourage you to put my responsibilities were and then to kind of list that. Really think about the verbs that you can use. And I'm gonna give you a little tip later on about what verbs to hone in on. Use the appropriate tense. And so unless it's sort of like a project or an event that you sort of worked on specifically, if you're still currently in that role, you should keep all of your verbs in the present tense. Qualify and quantify whenever possible. This person is doing that. They're saying sort of the working budget of $5,000. So they're giving you sort of a sense of what that actually has been. So anytime that you can add in numbers, that's a really great thing to do. It makes it feel like a much more legitimate experience to the reader. So think back and reflect and quantify wherever you can. And then as I think I've mentioned already, avoid using I statements or pronouns. So resumes are kind of a weird document in the sense that you are sort of speaking in the third person. And so you're not necessarily going to be saying I or we. You're just going to kind of list it and like I said, speak in the third person. Okay, so here's the tip on action verbs and what you can use for kind of starting your bullet points. So we have developed in our office a resume and CV guide. And so the link to access it is right there. But honestly, if you just Google OITE resume and CV guide, it should come up. It should be one of the links that pops up. And go through this. I think one of my favorite pages within this document is the one that I have on the screen right now. It's a sample action verb list. And so this gives you a good idea of the types of verbs that you should be using to start your bullet points. And we've even broken it down kind of by different sections. So for technical skills, research skills, teaching skills, management leadership skills, organizational skills, and this list actually goes on. I didn't include all of it. But these are good verbs to kind of think about using for bullet points on your resume. The biggest thing that I tend to edit and encourage people to change when I do resume reviews is people find a favorite verb and then they end up using it over and over and over again. I remember looking at a resume the other day, and this person used analyzed for 4 out of the 7 bullet points for the first section, and then maybe 3 out of the 5 bullet points for the next section. So really try to diversify the verbs that you're using. Think about different synonyms that you can use. Look to the job ad. If you're applying for a position, for kind of guidance on which verbs you should be using. And when in doubt, when you're reflecting on your experiences, I say this to everybody that I meet with, when in doubt, people are always going to like to see analytical skills, communication skills, and good team skills. So, think about those skills specifically as you're creating bullet points for your resume. And one thought about bullet points before we kind of continue on is a big question that I get from from students is often, how many bullet points should I have for each experience? And again, there's no rule. So you can, maybe there is an experience that you participated in where you were the student body president and you had a lot of responsibilities and you felt like you accomplished a lot. So maybe you could have even 7 bullet points for that experience. And then there's another role where maybe you were a committee member and you feel like, oh, only 2 bullet points is going to be sufficient. It doesn't have to be the same for each experience that you list. The only thing I would say is try not to have maybe just 1 bullet point. Try to go into a little bit more detail than that if possible. Okay, so this is the sample resume that I mentioned. So this is actually not listed within the OIT, the overall OITE resume and CV guide. This is going to be a resource that's available on the OITE website under high school resources specifically, because this is an example of a student applying to an NIH summer program. And so, you know, there's a lot of great things happening within this document overall. It's very clean, concise, easy to kind of read and skim through. They're using a lot of different style formatting options to kind of help the reader skim. They're listing all of the information that the reader is going to need to see and starting bullet points with great verbs. So think about kind of looking at these as sort of samples and examples overall. So I know I mentioned the horror story about somebody sending a resume where their name was eventually cut off. As you'll see on this resume sample, their margin is really small, and that's okay. You can actually play around with the formatting of your page and make your margins small. And that's something that I actually often recommend, especially as you advance in your career and you're trying to fit as much information as you can into kind of this tight white space. So, you know, as long as you're converting your document to a PDF before you email it, you know, you should be okay. So you can kind of play around with the margins overall. Okay, so the experiences, writing bullet points for different experiences. You know, I am the first to admit that the way people speak on resumes is really not how you speak in real life. So, you know, this is going to be something that you're going to kind of have to tweak. Maybe you're even going to talk to counselors and career mentors, you know, family and friends that you trust in order to kind of make sure that you're presenting yourself in the most professional way. So when you're thinking about sort of resume speak, this is what I'm going to be kind of focusing on for these next few slides. So writing bullet points is difficult. So a lot of times when people come in and meet with me, I'll often ask, well, what did you do? Can you just tell me a little bit more about that role, that experience? And they'll often say things like, well, I greeted visitors and I maintained an appointment database. And okay, that would be okay to put on a resume, but you do want to kind of tweak it and quantify whenever you can. So, you know, one way to revise this would be to say greeted and provided excellent customer service to congressional staff, constituents, visitors, and distinguished guests. If this person could give an average rate of how many people came on a daily basis, that would even be great to see. Likewise, for the next bullet point, you can tweak that into managed an office-wide appointment database for 30 staff members, holding approximately 1,000 total meetings per month. And that gives me a much better idea about how kind of detailed and involved that part of it was. Because when you first hear, okay, you maintain an appointment database, you think, okay, that's probably pretty doable. But for 30 staff members and over 1,000 meetings a month, wow, that's a lot of work. And that's, you know, requires you to be very, very detail oriented. So those are all things that, you know, don't just sort of look at sort of the face value of your responsibilities and try to market yourself in the best way possible for future positions. This is another very common thing that we often see sort of within resumes overall. So people will often come in and say, have a bullet point that they have excellent verbal and written communication skills. And when I see that, I think, really, and maybe even you're thinking to yourself, okay, how do I know that? And so you really want to kind of give them the data and give them the proof. So as I said, I work with scientists at the NIH, and so I always say that give the person the data, show them and quantify and qualify what that skill set looks like in real life for you. So instead of saying sort of a generic kind of blanket skill like excellent verbal and written communication skills, break that down for the person. So verbal and written communication skills can mean a lot of different things. So that can be presentation skills, it can be writing skills, it can mean that you're really great at editing. It means that you can facilitate group discussions well, negotiate, speak. Those are all things that you can kind of go into a little bit more detail to kind of help highlight for the person that you actually do possess excellent verbal and written communication skills. And think about this for kind of each skill set that you're trying to kind of portray, whether it's for a job application or even generally when you're applying to colleges and universities. So really definitely think about going into a little bit more detail when you can. Questions to ask yourself, and this is actually also included in the OITE resume and CV guide, but these are good things to reflect on and think about and ask yourself as you're creating your resume. So especially when you're creating your bullet points for your resume. So I would say that the majority of people just think about, okay, what were my job responsibilities? And I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. When I first started creating my resume, I think that's all I thought about too. I thought, okay, what are my job responsibilities? I think I maybe even looked at the job ad and just put that in my resume, or I may have like tweaked it a little bit. So don't sort of do that mistake. Think about sort of what your job responsibilities are, but elaborate on that. So reflect on what were your major accomplishments. And this can be a hard one. I completely recognize that because not every position lends itself neatly or nicely to having sort of this great aha accomplishment moment. Sometimes people will come in and say, well, my greatest accomplishment from this experience was this awesome publication, and that's fantastic. But you can even think about accomplishments in smaller terms. So I met with a person virtually a few weeks ago who we were trying to kind of think about accomplishments driven resumes and creating that for her. And she was thinking about her tutoring experience. And one of her biggest accomplishments was really helping and working closely with a student who really had struggled in their math class. And for her biggest accomplishment was really when that person not only passed the class, but did well and got a B. And so, thinking about it doesn't have to be this like, I won the Pulitzer Prize. They can be small accomplishments, but really try to focus on the accomplishments and listing that in your resume. Also reflect on what skills you've developed. I'm encouraging all of you to add a skills section into your resume. And so that's going to definitely be something that you're going to kind of need to delineate and note. And how can you quantify your results? And if that's possible to do, great. I know that that's also another thing that can be a little bit challenging depending on the role, quantifying the results. So other things that you could ask yourself would be, what decisions did I make? How did I work with people? How did I motivate people? How did I communicate in my job? Was I in a leadership position? Like I said, student organizations and work in even kind of community service or clubs counts as experience. So if you were in a leadership position, definitely kind of go into detail about that. And overall, how did you make a difference within that position? So that's a lot to kind of encompass in writing a bullet point. And hopefully that will kind of give you some motivation and some things to think about as you're writing your bullet points, because I think that one of the biggest mistakes that I see people early on in their career make is just not going into enough detail within their resume, especially within the bullet points. Okay, all right, so now we're going to move into one of the last sections on your resume, which is your skills section. So as I said, this is usually the very last. Keep computer filters in mind, especially when applying for jobs in particular. And organize by category. So a very common way to kind of organize this would be lab, computer, language. As you can see, this person went into even greater detail about biochemistry, cell biology, microscopy, molecular biology. Don't be intimidated by that. You know, it can just be as simple as sort of listing sort of like computer and language skills. For certain skills that you list on your resume, though, you need to actually annotate sort of your perceived proficiency level, especially for languages, and especially if it is going to be a requirement for the job. So as you can see, this person wrote languages, Spanish, native proficiency, Mandarin, basic proficiency. For those of you who aren't sure sort of what your proficiency level is within a language, actually the State Department, the US State Department has a pretty good page to kind of go through and help you assess what your proficiency level might be for a language. But those are all good things to kind of think about annotating, and also for computer. So I remember when I was in grad school, I had SPSS listed on my resume, but it was very basic proficiency. And I ended up being very grateful that I had annotated that on my resume, because when I got called in for an interview, they asked me to kind of sit down and kind of run a regression within the system. And I kind of went back to my resume and said, I noted that it was basic. Is there a greater need for sort of an intermediate level? And so, you know, that's a good way to make sure that you're also being honest with yourself, especially when you're applying for different positions where it might actually be tested. So one thing that I failed to say sort of at the beginning of this presentation, but I really want to kind of make sure is highlighted, is that resumes and CVs and job search documents overall are actually very different across the globe. And so a lot of the recommendations that I have given to you are from a very kind of North American and US specific focus. So when I say kind of these are things that you should not include on your resume going forward, this is again very focused on the US, because I know that I get to work with a lot of different international trainees at the NIH, and depending on where they're focusing their efforts in terms of their job search, some of these things actually might need to be included on their resume. But overall, within the US, these are things that you don't generally include. So you don't usually list your social security number. That's what SSN stands for. You don't usually put a photo, your height, weight, your birth date, and you might be kind of chuckling to yourself, but actually a photo and birth date and marital status, for that matter, are actually very, very common to include on certain resumes in different parts of the world. So, but generally in the US, those are considered actually illegal questions to ask. So you don't necessarily need to provide that information. Pay rate or salary requirements, I would generally admit that, especially when applying for different jobs, unless they specifically ask you to. Reasons for leaving previous employers, as I noted, your citizenship, marital status, city, country of birth. So the exceptions here are obviously if you end up applying for positions, for federal positions through USA Jobs, they will ask you for sort of your citizenship and social security number. So just be prepared that there are exceptions, but this is sort of a general overview. The other thing that a lot of people will actually question me on and say, really, I don't include that on a resume, is references. So references aren't actually considered a part of your resume. It's usually considered a separate document entirely. And if you're applying to colleges and universities, obviously you're going to be asking different people for letters of recommendation. When you're on the employment side of it and actually needing to list sort of references for the employer to check, it's usually just a separate document and a sheet of sort of the person's name, their role, your connection to them, and then their contact information. So you don't need to worry about including sort of those references on your resume right now. Okay, so let's see. Okay, we're doing pretty well on time. So I'm going to be wrapping up shortly the section on resumes and then kind of going into social media and marketing yourself on social media. So some general resume do's and don'ts. So let's start with the do's. So as I've noted, formatting is really key. It's really, really important to make sure that your resume is clean, concise, easy to skim. So the 20-second rule. If we were all in person, I would say, what do you guys think the 20-second rule is? And usually, so the 20-second rule is the amount of time that the person spends skimming your resume. I would actually argue that it's about 20 to 60 seconds. So making sure that your document is really well formatted is going to be of the utmost importance to make sure that this person says, oh, okay, great, let me read a little bit more. I want to learn more about this person. So formatting is really important. And within that, being consistent and structuring all of your sections the same. So like I mentioned, there are very few rules about resumes, but one of the strongly preferred recommendations is to be consistent in how you're listing the information. So no matter what you do in the education section, experience section, that you're putting sort of the organization on the same side of the page, the dates on the right side, or whatever you end up choosing to do, that it's the same throughout so the person can really easily skim. Same with your font. So there aren't necessarily any preferred fonts to use. I think some people would argue that some fonts are better than others. I think as long as it's not sort of a cursive, as long as it's sort of like a clean, like Calibri or New Times Roman or whatever it might be, that's easy to see and read, that should be fine. But make sure that you are using the same font throughout your document. So an easy way to make sure that you're doing that is just hitting select all on the document and choosing your font accordingly. So the other thing for size, font size. So again, no rule, but usually between 10 to 14 is what you should have as sort of your font size, with the exception being that your name should be the largest item on your resume. So sometimes I'll see people come in and they have an overall font size on their resume of 10, and I say, make your name 20. Like, let's make that big and bold so they can easily see it. And I also see people put a lot of their section headings, whether it be education, experience, skills, as a slightly larger font, just to kind of help delineate and kind of create that flow throughout the document. And that's totally fine to do, again, as long as you're doing the same thing for each section throughout. As I noted, you have to list all of your dates and locations for each of your activities and experiences, and you should list them in reverse chronological order. So reverse chronological order means that you're putting your most recent experience first and foremost. So if you have high school in your education section right now, as soon as you get admitted to college, and that you need to add that to your resume, your college is going to go ahead of your high school experience within your education section. And you're going to follow that rule and that guidance by section. So if you have different sections listed, if you have a leadership experience section, a research experience, a mentoring experience, you're going to keep it in reverse chronological order by section. So that's the way to think about doing it. Okay, so some don'ts. So these are compiled and kind of shortened, but I've seen a lot of different resumes throughout my career. And so one of my biggest pieces of advice in terms of what you should not do is try not to get too fancy and stand out for the wrong reasons. So, I will often hear a lot of people say, well, how am I going to stand out? How is my resume going to be picked out of that stack of 500 resumes that they've received? And so people end up doing things like making the formatting, kind of funky or unique, or putting their name vertically on the resume. This was, again, I'm dating myself, back in the day when people still submitted applications through the mail, and you would actually mail in your resume and cover letter. And there was actually such a thing as a resume paper. It was like a thicker kind of cardstock paper that you would have to print on. When I was a hiring manager, we had somebody send in a cover letter to us in the shape of a foot. And they said that they wanted to get their foot in the door at our organization. And that, wasn't a great way to stand out. It actually ended up having the opposite impression. So, make sure that you're standing out because you've crafted a really well formatted and clean resume, and not because you're kind of trying to be too fancy and do these different things. As I mentioned, don't use personal pronouns on your document, and try not to use a Microsoft Office template or any other templates that you find online. And you might be asking why I'm recommending that, but I would say that anytime I see a resume that was created using a template, it's very, very recognizable to me. And templates end up often creating kind of weird spacing and odd columns within your document that you don't really need. And so I actually think some of the best resumes that I've reviewed have been because people just opened a blank Word document, looked at some samples that they liked, and then created it from there. So really think about using some of the samples that you'll see on the OITE resume and CV guide as sort of an inspiration on how to kind of create that document for yourself. And then most importantly, please don't lie on your resume. It's really important for you to be kind of genuine and authentic, and presenting yourself. Obviously, we want you to present yourself in a sort of slightly elevated and professional and polished way, but by no means should you put down inaccurate information. There are many, many stories that if you could just Google about people lying on their resume where these things come back to haunt them. And that's also why I encourage you to even think about kind of being specific about your proficiency level for different skills, and just really making sure that you're kind of presenting a very authentic picture of you and your qualifications. Okay, so some final resume tips before we move on. So real estate matters within your document. So I always encourage you to sort of lead with your strongest attributes, put the most important things kind of at the top of the document, definitely on the first page if you end up going on to a second page. And absolutely, please make sure that you're double and triple checking for typos. I've seen a lot of really unfortunate typos when reviewing documents, and unfortunately spell check doesn't catch everything. So have other sets of eyes take a look at it. Your resume is going to be one of those documents that you look at so much and that you have added to so often throughout the years that you become a little bit numb to it and you aren't seeing things that need to be changed. So take advantage of faculty, mentors, colleagues, guidance counselors. Universities often have awesome career services offices that can definitely help you review your documents. And recognize, like I said at the beginning, that there are a lot of different guidelines and there's not one set rule. So opinions can vary, and there are lots of different ways to do this document really well. But really, I would kind of gravitate towards the advice from people who are working in a field that you're interested in going to, or who have successfully navigated either a college admissions process or a job search process that that went well for them. And so, really, those can be really helpful advice and input from those types of people. And one last thing about the typos, I remember meeting with a student who was sending out a cover letter, and she wrote that she was very detail oriented, and she misspelled detail oriented. And so this is, again, sort of another, anecdote about things that they're oftentimes looking for reasons to kind of weed you out and say, well, that's not really true. You're not very detail oriented because you didn't catch that. So, making sure that you're having other people to kind of look at these documents before you hit submit or before you hit send. Okay, and then the last point. So this is really more applicable for resumes that you're using to apply for different jobs or employment opportunities. But make sure that you're really tailoring each resume you send for each job posting and remembering your audience overall. People who tend to be really successful within a job search aren't sending out generic resumes. They're not sending out like 300 generic resumes. They're sending out 30 really well-tailored, really, highly crafted for that specific posting. And so really taking a chance to sort of remember your audience, which I know can be hard to do. So there are two resources that I want to draw your attention to that might be helpful when you're tailoring your resume for different roles. So the first one is actually a website that I used to use all the time. I loved it. It's called Wordle.net, and it creates word clouds, as you can see. So depending on what you upload, it will scan the document that you uploaded and see how many times you're using different words, and those words become bigger on the word cloud. And so if you're wordling your resume, you're going to kind of get a good sense of the skills that you're highlighting and making sure that that's going to be appropriate for where you're applying. Another really good one, and this is maybe even a better resource for you to use, especially when you're applying for jobs, is called jobscan.co. And you can actually copy and paste the job description, and then you can copy and paste your resume, and it will analyze how well you are tailoring your document for that role. And so it'll actually give you a percentage and show you words that you're not hitting properly. And so those are two resources to kind of think about using as you're kind of reviewing and making sure that you're tailoring your resume for different positions. So I know we weren't going to talk about cover letters. That's not listed in the title of the presentation, but I would be remiss not to share a little bit on cover letters with you, especially when we're talking about resumes, because for resumes, again, if you're applying for jobs, you should always send a cover letter with a resume. When you're applying for colleges and universities, obviously they're going to be asking you for a personal statement, a statement of purpose. And so that kind of takes the form of the cover letter. But if you're applying for a job, unless the job ad specifically says no cover letters, please, you should include a cover letter, and don't feel overwhelmed by it. It's usually pretty straightforward. We have, as I noted here, our OITE cover letter guide. So lots of good samples and kind of give you some ideas of how to structure this document. But don't go more than one page. One page in business letter format, 3 to 4 paragraphs. So thinking about sort of the first paragraph, how you found the job, why that employer. The first paragraph, I usually say, can you put sort of why them? Why are you interested in them? And then in the second and third paragraphs, you're really focusing on why you. So how you fit the position, what are the main skills, highlight their most relevant skills with examples from your resume. And then the fourth is obviously just expressing your interest in interviewing and thanking them for their consideration. So just a quick note when you are submitting resumes for jobs to also think about including a cover letter. Okay, so now we're going to kind of continue on with the presentation and talk about marketing yourself via social media. So I think that it's really important to note that social media, anything that you put on social media, it becomes public very, very quickly, or it can become public very, very quickly. And there are lots of different examples of social media and posts gone awry. So I just Googled this very recently, and there are dozens of colleges rescinding admissions offers as different racist social media posts emerge after the death of George Floyd. And this is not new. You know, we have heard this, a similar story for a lot of different current events that have come up, and colleges and universities are looking for these things, and they are going to be kind of checking out your online presence. So, you know, this is just sort of a disclaimer and a note that make sure that you're using social media wisely, and that you're not using it in sort of an egregious way. So when you're thinking about using social media specifically for professional purposes, the two main sites that I often recommend for people that I work with are actually LinkedIn and Twitter. And LinkedIn is sort of the go-to professional networking site. And so you might also be thinking, Twitter, really? Why would I use Twitter? So I'm actually going to kind of talk about Twitter first and foremost, and then delve into LinkedIn a little bit. So Twitter is quickly becoming, and actually has become, I would say, for the last 5 years, a really good site for career development, believe it or not. So there are a lot of different ways that people that I work with use Twitter. So oftentimes they're using Twitter for kind of built-in search tools. So you could put in a keyword, so you could put in a field that you're interested in. You could put in public health, biomedical research. You could also use hashtags. I work with a lot of postbacks and postdocs who have found opportunities that they're really interested in applying to just because they follow the hashtags science jobs or careers or tweet my jobs or hiring. So, you know, a lot of companies and organizations are recognizing that they need to market different roles and opportunities in a variety of different ways, and Twitter is a really powerful way to do that. If you're in high school, you know, you could even think about following different hashtags like college admissions or higher ed, and see sort of what's happening and what that dialogue is within those hashtags. Also thinking about sort of following companies or organizations that you're interested in. For you, it might be following colleges and universities of interest. You know, I follow my alma maters just to kind of see what they're doing and what everybody's up to. And so, you know, this is going to be, especially if you have sort of your dream list of colleges, you know, think about following them on Twitter just to kind of see what the conversations are that they're posting about. And Twitter has a lot of different functions. You can really stay organized by creating different lists. And especially now, you know, where everybody is meeting virtually, you can often attend different virtual events and conferences, and you can even follow the hashtag from the event to see what conversations are taking place. I've met with a lot of people who followed hashtags for different events and then connected with people that they were, you know, like-minded people that had a lot of sort of similar career interests. And so it can be a great way to also connect with people, sometimes even in very high level positions. One of the biggest things that I hear about as the pros of Twitter is that it kind of levels the playing field, and you can often connect with anybody, and you can tweet at anybody, and they can reply. And so that's one of the drawbacks that I often hear actually about LinkedIn, which I'm going to talk about next, is sometimes within LinkedIn, you can only start a conversation with somebody if they're within your network of contacts, or you have to kind of request an introduction, and it's not as easy to kind of start that conversation. So that's one of the benefits of Twitter. But LinkedIn, like I said, is really the go-to tool for professional networking. It's a really great place to kind of showcase your professional brand and connect with like-minded individuals. So things to think about doing within LinkedIn would be, start following organizations and universities, much like I recommended for Twitter, joining groups, participating in group discussions if you feel comfortable doing that, and using it mainly, its main purpose really is as a way to connect with other people. And so connecting with alumni from your high school, clubs, in your future universities, whatever it might be, this is a great way to really stay connected. And one of the big questions that I think is on people's minds is high school or even early college too young to start a LinkedIn profile? And I would argue that it's not. There actually is like a whole article on LinkedIn, mind you, of profile tips for high school students. And there are actually a lot of different articles. It started around 2017, really when people started encouraging people just starting out in their career or high school students to really start having a presence online. And so if you wanted to look at this article, I think it has a lot of really great tips. There's another one from Forbes, which had a lot of great tips for high school students. But just for the sake of time, I'm just going to go over a few with you today. So one of the benefits and reasons to kind of start LinkedIn in high school is really it's a way to start networking early. So it can help you kind of connect with your teachers, your coaches, your mentors, and it makes it easy for them to stay connected and follow your progress. And likewise, it makes it a little bit easier for them to kind of follow your progress and maybe even write a letter of recommendation for you should you kind of follow up later on. Setting yourself up for career success. LinkedIn has a lot of different jobs. According to their own data, they have 1.5 million student jobs and internships posted. So there is a function to look for jobs as well as looking for contacts. So it could be a way to kind of learn about new positions as well. And then lastly, getting inspired. And this is something that I think is really, important within your career as you're doing career exploration and development, looking at career paths of those who are in aspirational positions and seeing what their path was like in order to get there. So I often recommend this to people that I'm working with is to kind of, go through and look at LinkedIn, and you can maintain an anonymous setting if you would like, and, see who is working in different positions or at different companies and what their path was like. What did they major in? Did they go to grad school? Did they get an MBA? Did they get an MPH? Did they get a PhD? And kind of have a sense of what are sort of the skills and qualifications that are necessary in order to do well in sort of that aspirational role or in a field that you're interested in going into. So when you're thinking about creating your LinkedIn profile, what I would recommend, there are many, many things and many sections on LinkedIn that you can go into, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple for you right now. So the three main things that you would want to think about doing when creating your profile is have a professional photo. So, that's sort of your first introduction to anybody. So it's really easy nowadays to take a clean, clear, nicely cropped photo. You shouldn't be at the beach. You shouldn't have sunglasses on. Somebody's arm shouldn't be cropped out. So make sure it's just of you. Upload that. I'm going to skip to number 3. Add in a summary. So summary sections on LinkedIn are really important. This is the area where you can describe what motivates you, what you're skilled at, what you're hoping to do next. It's sort of the little primer and introduction to people. So as long as you have those 2 sections, I think it's okay to kind of say like, okay, for now my LinkedIn profile is good, and I'm going to kind of work on creating and editing it later on. But when you're using LinkedIn, the primary purpose is to connect with people. So if you see somebody that you want to connect with, make sure that you're personalizing those requests to connect. I have a colleague that I work with who will not accept any LinkedIn requests from somebody who hasn't personalized the message. If you just use that like generic, I would like to connect with you on LinkedIn, no, she's not going to accept you. So, making sure that you're explaining why you're wanting to connect with a person or how you know them or how you met them is always sort of like good etiquette and kind of good manners on LinkedIn. So those are my quick tips about your profile. If you go to this link down here, there's actually a whole checklist of different sections that you can kind of go through, and it has some good tips on things that you can do to sort of populate and make your LinkedIn profile good for you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about resources and then go answer any questions. So it looks like we have about 10 minutes left, so this should be good for timing. So one of the resources that I want to draw your attention to in terms of our office is we have an OITE career blog, and we have a lot of content. This blog has been in existence for over a decade now. So even if you search by keyword, resume, CV, LinkedIn, this one is talking about your transferable skills, you're going to see a lot of really great content pop up. So make sure that you're taking a look at the blog. And we also have a YouTube channel. So we have a few different videos, ones that you might be interested in are resumes and cover letters, CVs and resumes. And this content has grown exponentially during the work from home. So make sure that you continue to check that out and see what other resources are available. Okay, all right. So let's get to the questions now. Okay, so let me just try to go through them one by one. Okay, so can courses or Coursera courses I audit be added to the resume as certifications or achievements? So what I would actually recommend, unless the course gives you a certification of some kind, then you could list it under that. Normally for courses like that, I encourage you to put it under sort of like a professional development / training section, and then you can just list the class title and the dates that you took it. But that's a good question. That's a great thing to have. Can the seminar series be added to my resume under professional development training? Sure, yeah, absolutely. So any sort of workshops or things outside of sort of your regular academics that you want to include. A lot of people do put a lot of different workshops that are my office hosts sort of on their resume in some capacity. So I think depending on the relevance for what you're applying to, you could think about adding it in. Okay, is it necessary to put your major GPA, or should we just have your overall GPA in your resume? That's a really great question. So the major GPA, especially if it's higher than your overall GPA, could and probably should be noted on your resume. And I also think that especially when you're applying to eventually like grad school, medical school, sometimes they look at your major GPA specifically as well. So I think yes, you could absolutely put that on your resume. Okay, let's see. How would you advise people to prepare and tailor their job search to new fields of medicine popping up? Okay, so I mean, I think that new fields of medicine popping up, I would actually encourage you to kind of do informational interviews and ask people who are working in those fields what they would recommend and what maybe there are certain sections that should specifically be included on that resume. For any sort of very detailed, kind of nuanced and relevant to sort of a specific field, I always defer to sort of people who are working in that field. So obviously you can create new sections and kind of order them in terms of the level of importance and tailor that. But I would actually defer to kind of people who are working in those fields specifically. Okay, is it better to use a size 11, 12 font and have a resume 2 pages long, or to make the font smaller, 9 or 10, and condense it to 1 page? I would probably condense it to 1 page. I think 10 is a perfectly acceptable font. Some may argue that against me, but I think that it's okay and still readable. I think anything below that, don't do. So I wouldn't recommend going to 9 or lower. But my knee-jerk reaction, not having seen your resume, would be to keep it on 1 page with a smaller font. Can we still take some artistic liberties color or spacing with resumes, not just a paper with all black and white? Oh, this is a great question. And I think this depends on where you're applying. So I think you can take some artistic liberties, especially if you're applying for positions in sort of like a visual design space, or something that's going to kind of be a little bit more focused on, your artistic skills overall. But I would be still very modest about how you do it. There are some very kind of purist traditionalists who say your resume should really only be a white piece of paper with black font. I think having a little bit of color and maybe making your sections blue or something that's still easy to read is okay. But again, try to be a little bit boring and standard, I would say, on this document. Any advice for writing an effective professional career statement summary for both LinkedIn and a resume? That's a great question. So I didn't talk about qualification summaries, or sort of like overall career statements, because I think a lot of times when you're just starting out in your career, you don't necessarily need a qualification summary on your resume. But as you progress in your career, it can become a really nice thing to have. There actually is a sample of a qualification summary within our OITE resume guide. What I would recommend is just kind of creating like a one sentence overview. So I see a lot of people say, biomedical researcher with 10 years of experience and skills and expertise in, and then a colon, and then having a few bullet points of sort of their main level accomplishments or what they really want to highlight for that position. And so I think that can be sort of a nice format to use overall. And for LinkedIn, I would really encourage you to look at sort of, again, the aspirational profiles and see what people are putting in their summary sections, and get sort of advice, or not advice, inspiration from that. Okay, let's see. What do you put in the address or greeting when you don't know who the recruiter is for cover letters? Okay, so if at all possible, you try to do your sort of best internet sleuthing and find out who the person is that you need to address the cover letter to. If you really can't find the person, saying to whom it may concern or dear hiring manager is completely fine. Okay, is completely fine as well. How do you figure out who the hiring manager is? So that is very tough. And I think a lot of times the hiring manager is often kept very secretive. So sometimes you can infer who it might be from reading the job ad and then looking on LinkedIn. That's how I found out who the hiring manager was one time. Sometimes you can find it out by kind of doing your due diligence and your networking and talking to people. But a lot of times it's very hard to actually find out. So, do your best, but if that doesn't work, then you can always address this to your hiring manager or to your hiring committee. Should I add any social media accounts created for fun that display my interests? I probably wouldn't. I think that kind of falls under one of the sections that I often say, if the space allows, you can include it. So if you're looking for things to kind of fill up the page, then yes. But if you feel like your space is at a premium, then no. So one of the sections that I didn't talk about because it's not as common now, but a lot of people will put sort of like a hobbies or interest section. And that's okay. It's sort of like a final line on your resume, but it should really only be like 1 or 2 lines and not take up necessarily too much space on your document. Okay, as a rising senior, should I put my coursework on my resume like AP classes? Absolutely. Yep, that would be a great thing to do. You can put it under your education section. A lot of people will put a relevant coursework section and then just list class titles. So I think that's a great thing to do. If you have a previous career not related or connected to your med health career, how would you advise putting it on your resume? Should I not include it? So I would, think about, again, spacing and relevance. You can put it on your document. You probably don't want to lead with it, so you'll still want to lead sort of like your health experience first and foremost. You can put it on your experience or on your resume as related experience, and then have it listed. So I see a lot of I see a lot of high school students do something similar actually when they're talking about experience, and they're listing sort of all of the things that are going to be relevant for college or grad school. But then there are all these kind of part-time jobs that people want to highlight that I was able to work and go to school at the same time, but it's not necessarily relevant for your intended career field. So you could still list that under kind of related experience, but probably don't lead with it. Okay, let's see. What are a few major things you should know when researching a company? I think it depends on sort of what's important to you, and thinking about sort of what your values are in a career. So, you know, when I'm researching a company, I often look at their sort of mission statement. I often talk to people who are working at that organization to kind of get a sense of the work-life balance. You know, if it would be a good fit for me personally. So those are some of the things that I tend to look at. Other people might look at sort of like stock options or benefits or whatever it might be. So I think that really varies by person. Other than following on Twitter and reading company jobs, what other ways are there to find jobs and internships? So the two main ways to find job internships are really through online postings and word of mouth. And so those are going to be kind of the end all be all. So I think the online postings are a great way to start, but people tend to be more effective at job searching when they focus on networking and talking to their contacts and asking for referrals and recommendations. So I would really kind of focus on that part of it, and maybe using Twitter and LinkedIn as a way to connect with people in real life. Okay, what should you do if you want a medical internship but don't have any related medical experience? So you're going to want to focus on sort of any certifications or skills that you have that you would be able to bring to that experience. You know, I think a lot of times when I meet with postdocs who are applying to medical school, a lot of times they do a lot of volunteering or shadowing, and that can be a way to kind of help building up and showcasing your interest in the field. All right, I'm going to try to get through the final questions. I know we're nearing the end of our time. Okay, so for extracurricular activities on a resume, how involved do you need to be? How involved do you need to list it on your resume? So I think it depends on the activity. I've seen people do a variety of different things. So sometimes for different extracurricular activities, they'll just have it as like a list. So Habitat for Humanity, volunteer, and then the dates. I've seen other people put Habitat for Humanity, volunteer, the dates, and then a few bullet points about, you know, what they did or if their involvement was really more extensive. So I think it depends on the activity, but it is okay to kind of just have it as like a running list too. Okay, I think we're at the last question. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to quickly submit in the last 2 minutes. But the last question that I see is, what is the best way to present and write volunteer hours on your resume? So I think you could have a community service experience on your resume. And I see a lot of people actually list, they'll put hours, especially if they're applying to medical school, and sort of denoting how involved that experience was. But I think just generally having a community service experience is the way to go with that. Okay, last question. As a non-traditional student, how far back should I go when listing experiences on my resume CV? I've heard to go one step backwards. So undergrads should include high school experiences. However, I graduated high school in 2014. Okay, this is a really great question, and I'm glad that this is sort of the last question that we're going to be ending on. Because I think that there are sometimes recommendations that you shouldn't include experiences from, you know, from different parts of your life. So there's experiences don't expire. So if you feel like it's going to be relevant for what you're applying to, I would go ahead and include it. You know, and it really does depend on also sort of where you're applying. You know, federal resumes, I see people, they have to go back like 10 to 15 years. And so they're really kind of culling all of the information that they possibly can. And so, I think the better rule or rule of thumb to think about whether to include something on your resume is not necessarily the date, but how relevant it is going to be for the role or the opportunity that you're applying to. Okay, so I think that was it. Kristen, did I get everything?
Yes, pretty much. Those are the main
Okay.
ones. Thank you so much, Amanda.
Oh, you're so welcome. I hope that this was helpful for everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. It was a pleasure to present to you all.